So how's this daylight savings time working out for you today? Oh, not easy, is it? This morning at 7:30, I came out for Mass with my stool turned around the other side, and someone had to remind me it wasn't Pentecost yet. So, Lent. I have been for a long time puzzled as to why Jesus would willingly follow the Spirit into the wilderness, into the desert, to be tempted by Satan. Have you ever been curious about this? It doesn't sound like a very nice thing for the Holy Spirit to do, does it? Jesus has just come from the River Jordan, where he's been baptized by his cousin John. We know that this was probably one of the most important spiritual experiences in Jesus' life to that point. Because what did he hear at the baptism? He heard God's voice in his heart saying, "You are my beloved." But it's precisely from that then he is driven out into this desert by the Holy Spirit to be tested. To be tested so that he understands those words that God spoke to him are true. Most of us don't go into the desert willingly. In fact, it's something we try to avoid at all costs. We don't stop there unless our car stalls out or we run out of gas, metaphorically speaking. Generally speaking, we prefer life to go on as usual, with our roles, our routines, staying in the familiarity of our comfort zones. The desert is a liminal place. It's between here and there. Some place you have to go through in order to get someplace else. On maps, it's often this big sandy spot without anything on it, because there's unknown dangers that lie in the desert. We go there only when we're dragged against our own will by circumstances that we don't choose in our lives. I'm thinking today, and how can't we think of the Japanese people? You know, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people who have been radically affected by a natural catastrophe that no one necessarily saw coming. Their lives are overturned, and now they find themselves in the desert, trying to make their way. We think of how the experience of personal illness or the illness of people we love puts us into a desert place to be tested. We experience the desert when our marriages fail, or when we succumb to addiction, or when, for instance, we lose our jobs. The desert turns our lives on end, and there we have to ask ourselves deep questions. Who am I? What's my purpose? What's my worth in the world? The desert is generally a place we avoid. How many of you, raise your hands, have seen the movie that came out this past week, The Company Men? Raise your hands. Okay, a couple people. I don't get royalties from this, and I must say, if Father Neil got royalties for recommending movies, he'd be a very wealthy man, right? The Company Men it's an all-star cast. It's probably one of the best movies that's come out this year, and I think you very easily can get the sense of the plot of it. It's a familiar scenario these days. A company, a corporation in crisis, brought on by the local economy, all the crisis that we've had over the last 3 years, and a company that's taking desperate measures to downsize those who are redundant. Thousands are laid off, even those who are the most skilled and some of the most long-serving in that company. There's 3 men in particular, played by Ben Affleck, Tommy Lee Jones, and Chris Cooper, and each of them loses their jobs, and it creates for each of them an existential crisis. Without work, without their position, without their security, who are they? What is their purpose? What is their worth? Each of them has come to over-identify a bit with the power and position of their roles, with their big houses and flashy cars. Tommy Lee Jones is able to fly around in a private jet. They have prestige as players at the table. Not one of them is really a bad person, but each of them has lost their way, lost their path along the way, forgotten who they are, forgotten where they came from, lost the values that they grew up with as younger men. They got wrapped up in those roles, and so those roles came to so define them that one of the characters feels like at the day he lost his job, he really lost his life, that the world came to an end. And he couldn't believe that the trains kept running and the newspaper kept showing up on the doorstep. There are times when we experience the desert in a way that throws everything into question. Who we are, what's our purpose, what's our worth. Now, each of these men had to face those questions. They had this opportunity in that time of trial and test to prove their hearts, to demonstrate their integrity, to soften their pride and their self-sufficiency and reach out for help, and to be sensitive to those who are in need. Was it a test from God? I don't think so. I don't think God tests us that way, my friends. I do believe that these circumstances do come upon us in lives, and they're opportunities for us to demonstrate our worth, but they're not tests given to us by God. God knows who we are. God knows our purpose, and God knows our worth. It's just that sometimes we need to rediscover it for ourselves. God knows because in and through Jesus' experience in the desert, God knows what it's like to ask those questions. God knows what it's like to be hungry. God knows what it's like to be lonely and confused. In each of these temptations that Jesus faces in the desert, he faces the deep questions in each of our lives. When he's hungry, at the end of those 40 days and 40 nights, and Satan comes to him and tempts him to turn those stones into bread, he's tempted to feed himself, to use his power to do something miraculous. And how amazing it would be to have such power, right? To be able to feed ourselves by turning stones into bread. But Jesus knows that self-sufficiency is not the path God calls us to. That in fact this is precisely how Satan ends up in his predicament, by shutting himself off from his Creator. And how often does self-sufficiency become a temptation for us? In the second temptation, it may not immediately occur to us, but when Jesus is taken up to the top of the temple parapet, he is brought to the most populated place in the Jerusalem city. In fact, there would be crowds, maybe thousands of people, milling around at the foot of that temple. And if Jesus were to throw himself off, and angels were to grab him up in front of the crowds, imagine who could deny that he was the Son of God. Jesus would win over all these people and their estimation of him by proving himself with this miracle. But he knows he cannot coerce people in this way. That the estimation by people and the passing kind of estimations or sort of opinions of people is no basis for his own self-worth. He knows who he is. But how do each of us struggle with the perceptions of others? How do each of us manage to show up in an authentic way, even when it's unpopular, even when we're afraid of what people think? One of these poor men in the film is told by his wife, "Don't come home before 6 o'clock. I don't want people to see your car in the driveway. I don't want people to know that you're unemployed." Imagine the burden of that. Finally, the last temptation. Jesus is shown all the kingdoms of the world and all of their wealth. And basically Satan says, "I'll give you all of these to build your kingdom." And how tempting would that be? How tempting to any of us. But Jesus knows that piles of wealth and security are not the path to the kingdom. That in fact, all of these things can be taken away. that his worth, his purpose is someplace else. Why did Jesus go into the desert willingly? I believe he knows that the only way back to that paradise, that garden described in Genesis, is through that desert. It's through that period of testing and trial. In Lent, my brothers and sisters, we enter into the desert willingly like Jesus. We enter into this time to purify our hearts, to soften our pride, to demonstrate our integrity, to become more sensitive to our brothers and sisters in need and generous to them. It's a time, really, for us to deepen our spiritual lives. And what a time it is. It's an invitation to return to paradise, in a sense, through this path of trial and testing. Most importantly, I'd like to leave you with one thought. The true way back to the paradise that Jesus seeks, the one he describes as the kingdom of heaven, is to remember that we share the same identity, purpose, and worth that he discovered in his baptism. We share his identity as beloved children, and our purpose and worth is to love.